and I'm recording it now. So let me just consult the Oracle Google and say, like, what should we add a texture to this cube as? Like some wood planks or like marble? Let's choose some marble. Copy image address. Looks pretty good. And yeah, we'll just save it to my desktop for now. And I'll save this to my desktop. It'll be UV lesson. And let's get another image just as an example. Oh, I'll just do a cheesy thing like this. I'm just getting some assets ready real quick that I forgot to get ready. Okay. So before I showed you how to like add a texture to an object in a way that was like basically like making like a TV screen, where you're like, okay, I have this plane is going to be my screen, and I'm going to make it the shape of what a screen might look like, and I'm going to add a material, call it TV screen, and then the next step would be to add a texture to it. And to do that, I click on this dot next to my base color to input something other than a single color into this. And we're going to choose an image instead of one single color, which is a grid of many colors. We're going to open an image, and I'm going to choose, let's see, what did I save this? Oh, a screenshot I made. And it's like, oh, wait a second. That's like sideways. And if I look at my original image, the original image is just a screenshot I took of class. And it's horizontal. How many people ran into a situation like this? Anyone? Where you added a texture, but it's like, oh, it's not like... Yes, so everyone. So I apologize I didn't go over this sooner. But it seemed like everyone figured it out. I usually don't introduce textures that early into this class. I usually wait until we're doing the final to do this. So I didn't anticipate that there's going to be some of these issues. So I apologize, but we're gonna now learn the right way. And so maybe your solution would have been like, well, crap, now I'm just going to have to shrink this and scale it like this. And that works, you know. But what we're going to do is we're going to learn why it's like that. And we're going to try and also texture a more three-dimensional object. So let me see if this is going to be helpful. Yeah. So I'm going to select this object that I already have a texture on, and I'm going to go to one of these tabs at the top. So we haven't really covered these tabs too much, and you may have noticed them. We have layout, which is our default one. That's what we're generally looking at. We have modeling, which is more of an open space for like modeling and edit mode. We have sculpting, which is really fun, that we'll get to soon. And then we have UV editing. And UV editing is a way to apply two-dimensional images to three-dimensional objects. So what UV stands for UV mapping. So UV, what those letters stand for, are like, essentially they're standing in for X, Y. When we're talking about our objects, generally in 3D space, we're talking about X, right here, X, Y, and Z. You know, width, depth, and height. And when we're applying a two-dimensional image to a three-dimensional image, they just gave it a couple other letters to describe what that is, which is U and V. So how do you take this two-dimensional image and wrap it around a three-dimensional one? Well, you kind of have to unpack it. Looking at our basic plane here, we see on our left the image we have for the material. So we have this object, and we see the image we are projecting onto it. The image hasn't changed. The image is still the right proportion and everything. But if I select this object and I go into edit mode and I start selecting vertices, we can see these vertices show up in our UV map editor. And so if I go to my UV editor window and I try moving those vertices, we can see in our 3D space that our texture is distorting based on how I move that vertice. So this vertice right here represents this vertice right here. Those are connected. And so if I wanted to scale this in a weird way, I could do that. I could stretch it out like crazy. But the issue here is we want this. If we want this shape to stay the same, right here, then we need to change this mapping over here. So currently, if we wanted this shape right here to read as though it's a screen, we'd want, it looks like the top of the screen image is right here. So we want this to be here. So we'd have to like rotate it to get this top to be over here. So let's try doing that. If I select all my vertices, and I'm still in edit mode right now, I see those vertices show up in my UV editor. I could select them all here, and I could, whoops, rotate them. Whoops. So it's rotated. It kind of looks correct, but we see that it's like sort of mapped beyond the image. So that means probably it's repeating. Let's do this. So we rotated it, now we're just making this fit the image again. And now we have an intentionally placed one. It looks like it's upside down, so if I wanted to, I could just select everything, rotate, and just flip it. And we'd be good. So now I have this image mapped to my plane here. Let's try that with a more complex object and with a different image. I'm going to go back to layout. I guess I could have done that in there, but whatever. I'm going to go back to layout. I'm going to choose my cube. And we're going to give it a different material. We'll just call this marble. And I'm going to add the texture using a different interface. So, let me go to shading. Yeah, that would work. I don't like that though. Sorry, I was talking to myself for a second. I do that sometimes. So I want to look at a different window in order to add some materials to this. Right now we have our timeline at the bottom. I could either create another window by dragging up from the corner, or I could just select that icon at the top left, and I can choose whatever I want to be this window. And if you're doing UV editing, you don't have to use the tab. You could just click on this icon, and there is a UV editor right there. So you can do it all in the same tab window, which is what I generally do. But these do make things quicker because there's kind of like a stock setup for like the windows you need, so you don't have to like mess around too much. So what I chose was the shader editor. And I bring this up because this is like helpful when you're working with textures to see what's really going on behind the scenes here. And I briefly showed this in another class, but I wanted to sit with it for a little bit longer. So in the shader editor, and you don't have to use this editor necessarily, I think it makes things easier to understand. You can do everything in this shader materials property tab here. But this is just a more sort of like, it's like more physical layout of what's happening over here. So if we were, and it's the same information, if you notice, we have, what we have here are two boxes. One is the box to output the material. And we see a line going to the surface. And that surface is like the surface of this object we have selected. The surface. That's what we're putting there. And currently we're just putting the color white there. And it's coming out into the surface node, so white is there with this amount of roughness, this amount of metallicness, and so forth. And all these options we see here are expressed over here. We've seen them before. They are the same, and they are linked. If I change one value here, they are expressed here. This is just another way to see what's going on here. So if I wanted to add a texture, I could go to my tab over here and click on the dot next to base color, choose image texture, and look what happens. We have the options to open an image here, but we also have a new node, is what it's called. A new box. A new like functional object you connect to other things to change something. And I can do that same thing. Whoops. Wow, okay. In here, I could add a texture, an image texture. And I would take the color from this and put it into the base color. So let's open it up. Let's find that marble texture I downloaded off the internet. This probably isn't seamless. Does anybody understand what seamless means when we're talking about textures? Have you encountered that term before? No. Anyone else? It's okay if you haven't. You think once? So a seamless texture, well, tell us what it is, Francisco. Would you mind? Weird. Yeah, I can't hear you, Francisco. I'm not sure what the deal is. Maybe make sure your mic, well, no, you're unmuted. How many instances of Discord do I have here? Can anyone else hear Francisco? It's okay. We can move on. I don't know what the deal is with the audio. I can't. Anyways. You can. Oh, weird. Well, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna have to keep going with the lesson for the moment. But apologize, Francisco, about the audio issues. I don't know why myself and Eric can't hear you. Or maybe I'm the only one. But what I imagine you said is what I'm going to say, which is a seamless texture is just a texture that you can repeat, that you could like stack next to itself. And you couldn't really see where one part of the image stops and ends. So it's a way to like, if you say had like a really huge floor, let's do a test real quick. Look at this huge floor. And I want this to have the marble texture. But I want that texture to be like smaller. I'm just going to do this real quick. I'm making that texture repeat more, but you can see here the seams. You can see where the texture repeats, right? And so if you get a seamless texture, and there are people that make these specifically for 3D assets and other things, you wouldn't see the seam. This like crack right here would like seamlessly flow into, so the left side and the right side sort of continue each other's drawing. And it's the same with the top and bottom. Anyways, shorts, sidetrack. I'm good at those these days. So where was I? So we have this marble texture, and I was going over the nodes here. So we have a texture here. The color is going to the base color of our shader. And our shader is the thing that sort of represents the material for the object. And what we have right here is our principled shader. This is the default thing you're generally using. And this is something that was like developed, I think last year, where it sort of combined a lot of different features into one sort of node. Which is why we have metallic and like sort of glossy stuff with things that are good for glass and other things at the bottom. They sort of made like a master shader that contains a lot of details in it. Before, like metallic was its own separate node and you have to mix it in. So we have our image going into the color of our shader, which is going to our surface, which is what we're seeing. So let's unwrap that and see how this looks. You know, I guess with this image it's kind of hard to tell what's going on exactly. But if we go into edit mode, we can see how this cube is being displayed or projected onto our image. Which is that it has been sort of opened up. We see, and let's see what we got right here. Let's select, oops. Whoa, 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 whoa. What is going on? Huh? 1 second, something happened. Move and attach. Huh? Ay, ay, ay. Come on, man. Oh, there we go. Alright, so we have them all selected here. And we have each side of this cube represented here. So let's see if we can maybe see which one this is. This would be the top of the cube. I think this is the center one, and then it sort of opens up. I'd imagine this is this one over here, or out the side maybe. Oh, bottom. Like that. So this is how a three-dimensional cube is projected on a two-dimensional image. And sometimes when you have more complex objects, or you're trying to like add materials to things, things might look distorted, and you might need to re-map out how the image is attached to that. So let's maybe try to add like a cylinder. And sometimes also, like, if when you're doing this, maybe things look different. Maybe things look like, when you automatically open it up, it looks like all confusing, like this. And you're like, that's not what I want. That's confusing. There are ways to unwrap this manually. So if you're in edit mode, if I select this object and I'm like, oh, what happened? I just added a texture to this and it's all kind of like messed up over here. It's like distorting. You would go into edit mode. You'd make sure you have your UV editor open. And you would go to UV at the top. And there's an option to unwrap, which is sort of a quick way to, like an automatic way to just sort of unwrap the object, and which basically sounds like, you know, unwrapping a present or opening up a box and laying it flat. But there's other ways to unwrap things. And if you scroll down, we have cube, cylinder, and sphere. And I feel like these three options go a long ways as to like helping you define your, like, wrap an object. And so for this one, of course, I'd probably try cube. And that works pretty well too. It's a little different layout, but now we have sort of the same image projected on either side. And in some places where it's like mirrored, it almost looks seamless. Let's try that for the cylinder. Let's add the material to the cylinder. You can have multiple materials. Like, we're not changing the material when we wrap this. It's staying the same. So we can have it on different objects. And that looks like it came out pretty good. And we look at this in edit mode, we see that it instinctively knew, there is like an automatic feature to this sometimes in Blender. It knew that it should separate the top and bottom cap and have a sort of ring. So then like this sort of circle is then like sort of laid out flat. That cylinder right there, all the way around. If you're trying to unwrap, do a UV editing for a very specific object and it's not working for you, we should definitely have like a one-on-one meeting. I want to be able to do more of those if you guys are having more issues with stuff. I feel like those sort of interactions are very helpful sometimes to get over issues you're having. And I want to be able to like make time to do that. And I wanted to just go over one more feature about shading and about how textures are used. So I'm back at my main tab and I still have this shader editor open where we have our marble texture going into the surface. And right now, let me make sure I'm in the right viewing mode. Yeah, let's add some lights in here because we're gonna get experimental a little bit. Let's add a ground as well, so these things aren't just like living in some weird spot. Now let's give it a little bit of color. And let's turn on screen space reflections. So we have a texture controlling the color of our cube. Yeah? And maybe let's real quick add a texture to control the color of our ground. We could add a texture, and let's do that checker texture. And we could have that change the color, and we'll make one of the colors be that orange color I just chose that I liked so much. And the other color, let's make it just like black. And let's make the scale 10. I like this. So a lot of how like textures are used in 3D rendering for like, you know, really nice architectural visualization. I think I might be able to show you guys something real quick. Let me see here. Nope, not that. Not this probably either. Well, I mean, this is kind of helpful. I probably shouldn't be showing you this, but so this is a 3D rendering that I worked on for a company where they have a product which is this table. And I made this chair. And in part of making this chair, I made this material for the upholstery, for the fabric. And the way this reacts to light is that if it looks as though it's like carpet where there's like little pebbles of like things that cast shadows, so there's a texture to it. There's like a physical texture to it. And the way I achieve effects like that, and this is the same thing for like video games. So like if you see like characters and you see like a lot of like depth detail to their body, and like you see like sort of like pores on their skin, or you see like a rough sort of like I don't know, scratch like on their armor or something like that, but it looks like it's like physically a dent. Sometimes that's just a texture. But you can use textures in many different ways to achieve different effects. You can use textures to control all of these values we have, including displacement or normal, which is essentially the 3D-ness of it, the depth of it. And so this is me getting a little advanced, but I feel like it's helpful to know these things because I think it like sort of opens your mind when you're looking at what other people have made in 3D, or even if you start like encountering, like if you start downloading things off the internet, you might encounter different textures, and this is how you might implement them. So what I'm going to try first is, and I'm just like kind of playing around here, with this marble texture, we see that it's a little bit shiny. We can change that value. But if we just plug in the color value into the roughness, let's see if we can see something. We can see that right now the darker areas are very shiny and the whiter areas are very rough. And if I wanted to, I could convert this. I could go to Add Converter, and I could choose something called a color ramp and place that in between these two nodes. This is advanced a little bit, and you don't have to do this, but I feel like this is maybe helpful for some who want to explore this. And so what this does is it converts the color of our texture into a gradient depending on the dark values and the light values, and map it to these two values here. And we can invert them if we wanted. And we can start to change. You can see the amount of roughness that is being displayed in different parts of this image by changing these values. We could do this for the metallicness of this, though you might not be able to tell so much what's going on. You could control, I think, even the emission of this object. So now we're just saying everything that is, I think, white here is now emitting color, and everything that is dark is not. And now it's the opposite, where the dark things are now emitting color. That looks trippy, right? You could also say, okay, and this is a little advanced as well, you would add something called a vector. And what we're going to choose is a bump. And I'm going to plug this bump, which is essentially a bump map. It's a way to fake something having like a three-dimensional texture. I'm going to plug the normal of this into the normal of this. We're not going to get into what normal means, just understand that normal goes into normal. And I'm going to add another one of those converters, the color ramp. Plug this into there, plug this into height. And look at what happens. So say you have like a sort of like brick texture or like an old stone texture for the ground you're using. Like you're like, oh, I want my environment to have like a stone floor or ground, or like a natural looking ground. Or like maybe it's just sort of like kind of rough cement. You can add that image texture, but if you can get a way to sort of like also map a value, and sometimes there's separate images that you can get for things that are specifically for this function, for this bumpy function. We can change the strength of it, make it more subtle. But we see now that the way it responds to light is as though it is three-dimensional. Like we are giving dimension to this two-dimensional flat plane on the side of the cube. This is used all the time in video games. This is how so much detail is achieved, by sort of mapping textures and using textures creatively to help with realism when you don't want to continually, because if I were to try to like sculpt this using just polygons, using just the tools I have in 3D space to add vertices and everything, it would get so complex and it would take up so much memory. And to have that as like, you know, like the brick of a church, you'd have to duplicate it so many times and it would just like crash your computer. So this is how you can like scale up detail with ways like this. I could use the same ramp for something like, I don't know, let's just like use it for the roughness. And let's turn up this all the way. See, now we can see it looks like it has some dimension. And now the veins are the only parts that are shining, which would be the dark parts. Dark would be a value of 0. 1 would be a value of white, is the way that's sort of used. And we can play with these, how they're sort of interpreted, flip them if we want. Have the veins pop out, or so forth. I usually don't get into this with this class, but I kind of felt like this was a good moment to kind of like dive into, just as like a lesson, even to like understand, because like I feel like even if you as like a student and a young professional don't go into 3D animation or game design or whatever as your main field, like you're going to encounter these things. And it's interesting to know how these virtual worlds are being built that we're now so more frequently inhabiting, you know? It's like understanding the architecture of this of the environments that we live in, you know? Sound off in the Discord if that was like too much information. It is recorded if you ever want to revisit that and you're like, oh, that looks cool, I want to do that. Just slowly go through these steps, or just like email me and be like, can we make a texture like this together for, you know, this project I'm working on. Once you understand this shader setup, how these nodes actually function, once you feel comfortable with that, there's so much room for experimentation. And a lot of like different 3D software and video game software use similar nodes to this. Like if you want to learn how to make, oh yes, absolutely. So like, yeah, I encourage you to go for this. I'm trying to think of like a good place. So there are resources for like free 3D models that I have on links for our site. I think I have a link for Polygon. Do I not? Not the video game site, but like the... I don't. I'll have to add that. So a nice website is called Polygon. Oh, too many eyes. Polygon.com. So Polygon, P-O-L, 2 I's, G-O-N. This is a company started by a guy who's kind of like a famous YouTuber for Blender. If you look for tutorials, I think I have a link to his YouTube page. He does a lot of like helpful and kind of fast, well-edited like explainer videos on different features and everything. And this is like, this is a market where you're supposed to buy stuff, but they do have some for free. And so if you go to textures here at the top, you can see where you can find different textures. And so this like Spanish tile or terracotta tile here, this is a texture that creates the look of a 3D like tiled roof. So when you are like playing like, I don't know, like Sekiro or some game where you're like a ninja running on top of somebody's roof and you see tiled roofs, that's all just a texture, man. That's not like a three-dimensional thing. It's like probably a plane. It's probably, and there's the ways these things sort of like pass by your sort of sight as like these like tricks are just fascinating. And we see for this one texture, we have these maps. So the resolution is high. You can get it up to 3K, which is like a 3000 by 3000-ish image, which is high resolution. And we have bump is what I used for this right here, this bump. So you would plug in that bump texture to height. Diffuse. Diffuse is base color. That's the regular diffuse color. So that would be like just the basic color image of what that looks like. Displacement. Displacement is a sort of like further way. You would plug that in over here. Using a different kind of vector. You would plug in a vector for displacement there. And your bump map will probably go into your height. And what that does essentially is it actually kind of more physically pushes out the geometry of the object. So it's just a more it's just a stronger effect than what like a simple bump map might do. It really like pushes things out, like it actually morphs when you render it out, that it changes. So that's really what we're getting here with the displacement. Gloss would be how glossy it is. Reflection would be like, I think, specular on our shrimp? Our shader. Why did I say shrimp? Specular. Yeah, anyways. If you want to play around with how these work, maybe go to Polygon and look for some different textures. I think for every category, they seem to have at least one free material, and maybe see what happens. Like, get the images, play around in the shader editor, and see how many. All you have to do is just add an image texture. Whoops, not that. Add an image texture, and then you get all those as a zip, unzip them, and then just like find the different parts and figure out how to plug them in. There's lots of like videos, and I can find more in-depth things for you to like explore that. I would say even like look at, I'm pretty sure the Blender Guru, the guy who made Polygon, he's got an Australian accent, which could be a plus or a minus, depending. And I think, anyways, I know he has, let's see if he's got one. Let's see if we can search his videos. Videos, let's see, PBR Textures. And so what those textures are called, so I would look at these, how to make photorealistic. Those would be something to check out. These textures that we're speaking about, I think PBR means like physically based renders. I think it basically is like physically based or photo based rendering is what it is. So it's like using photos or images to sort of like create texture. And one other cool note, I'm going to select my checkerboard, and so there's other kinds of textures you can add. And since I'm already on this tip, I'm just going to go for one more thing. You can add your own different kinds of textures within Blender. If you go to texture, we already have the checker texture for the color. We have brick, which you can imagine what that's like. Image, magic, and then down here there's a lot of sort of generative, like noisy kind of textures. So we're going to use one, let's just go with the noise texture. And you could try like taking one of these values and plugging it into like the vector of the checker. What the heck just happened? So let's see what this looks like on its own. That even shows anything. The noise texture is just sort of noise. It's kind of like what you might see in like clouds, or just like static, basically. You can change the like roughness, the detail of that. I don't know what the default was. How it's distorted, if it starts to like ripple or not. And it sort of outputs like a 0 to 1, like a black and white control value that can control how metallic, specular, shiny, bumpy anything is. And sometimes I experiment with just like adding a noise texture into something like a checker texture, where it's like taking that checker pattern, but like messing with it, like plugging in like chaotic noise into it, you know? But I could also take this noise texture, and if I wanted to create like the feeling like this ground is like sort of kind of bumpy a little bit, we could do something like this. We could do that same technique. I would add a converter, which is the color ramp, You can also, there's a shortcut if you hit like F3, you can just type in whatever you want to do. Type in color ramp, you get it. And I can plug in this factor into factor. And then we're missing one more, which is add vector bump. Put the color into height and the normal into normal. So now our ground still has that checkered color, but it's got this like sort of like bumpy look to it. Like what a natural floor might look like. And so just a simple little tweak like that makes something go from like looking like it's like, you know, like definitely looks 3D to something where you're like, oh, this looks like kind of like a little realistic. Like it's sort of like dealing with light or responding to light in ways that I don't quite, that doesn't quite look like fake, you know? You don't have to go this route also. I mean, these are just ways to experiment, and I figured it'd be good. I like to bring in like things like the shader editor because like there's so much room for just like experimenting here. Like when I learned how to do this, I just started plugging things in, you know, and just like messing around and seeing what came out. And you can come up with like some really weird looks, you know. And so that could even be like what you do for your finals, just like come up with some like freaky like patches for your colors. Anyways, I'm gonna save this and maybe I'll see if I can post it to our announcements or something, or to the link for the video for this. So if you wanted to, you could download this and it'll contain the textures and you can see what's going on here if you wanted to try to recreate it. I'm going to save this and quit and minimize. And I'll throw up a link for Polygon in the course links. Any other questions? Or any questions at all? So everyone's clear. You gotta, the 3 gifts are due on Tuesday. I think we're gonna have like a sort of casual critique presentation around that. So on Tuesday, whoever has their work done, we're gonna like, and I can facilitate that. I can like, what would be nice is we could just share our gifts and take turns sharing our gifts in like a chat room. I can create like a midterm chat room, and so you could drop the gifts in there and we can look at them and we can give each other feedback. But after that, we're really just sort of, we're going to start diving into what's the final and like how can we achieve that. And I think I'll have some more information for you then so we can start going. Because this, I thought we had an extra week left, but looking at our calendar, it's like we have 1, 2, 3 weeks, and then our final is on the 23rd. For some reason I thought our final was on the 2nd of March, but it's on the 23rd. So we have 3 weeks to work on our final project, and then finals are due on the 23rd. But we'll get it done. Don't worry about it. Any questions?